Welcome to the Software Process and Measurement Cast number 708. I'm Tom Cagley, your host. Today, 107 podcasts ago, that's just a little over 2 years, on SPaMCAST 601, I interviewed Brian Weaver of Torch.AI about leadership. Lots of things have happened since then. A pandemic, Europe in flames, and Torch.AI thriving. It was great to touch base with Brian to talk about how his perspective as a leader has changed. While not needed for this interview, I highly recommend you go back and listen to SPaMCAST 601, link in the show notes, before or after, doesn't matter, just go listen again. Brian serves as CEO of Torch.AI and has more than 20 years of experience leading mission-driven, high-growth, technology-focused companies. Torch.AI helps leading organizations leverage artificial intelligence in a unique way via a proprietary enterprise data management software solution. Today, Torch.AI supports clients like H&R Block with fraud detection and mitigation, the U.S. Department of Defense with machine learning-enabled background investigations for federal employees, supporting the determination of individuals' trustworthiness and security credentialing. Are you ready to re-examine leadership in the world we live in now? It's time for the interview. Brian Weaver of Torch.AI, ringmaster of Torch.AI. Welcome back to the Software Process and Measurement Cast.
Hey, thank you, Tom. Great to be back.
It's fun to talk to somebody who is part and parcel of something cutting edge a couple of years after you talk to them the first time. So before we really get in hot and heavy, what's different in the AI market from 2 years ago, other than probably everything?
Yeah, for us, it's been really fascinating. The market's maturing in a really great way. People really understand, I think, what machine learning and artificial intelligence really is, right? It's part of everybody's daily existence more and more today. And certainly, I think people have become more aware of even some of the risks of things like bias, for example, in artificial intelligence. But I think, generally speaking, even though the world has seemed to slow down almost in a surreal way with COVID and now all their other world events. In a lot of ways, the technology has advanced pretty rapidly. I mean, we're on a virtual teleconference today using technology that's evolved in a really fantastic way over the last couple of years. And the idea that a machine can learn and evolve on its own, as opposed to kind of leaning on static rules, as we say, is pretty amazing. So anyway, I think we're really getting into an era of technology where the promise of the technology is really fulfilling itself. And I think there's more great things ahead with compute advancements, chip enhancements, and all that fun stuff that make it all possible.
So in an organization, in an industry that is that dynamic, how do you cut through the noise? How do you actually lead in that kind of a scenario?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, there's literally thousands of companies that play around in the data infrastructure, and artificial intelligence space. And for us, I think most of those companies are really, and this isn't meant to be derogatory in any way, but most of them are academic. There's very few companies that are actually applying artificial intelligence to real world situations. In fact, one of the things about being a company that's headquartered in Kansas City that we've learned, this market, it's wonderful. A great place to live, great standard of living, amazing engineering talent. But it's really tough from a product perspective because, everyone, it has to work. They're hard on you. And there's not a ton of investment capital. And so when you have an advanced idea, in order for it to work, you have a bit of a conservative, risk intolerant attitude. And so for us, we really focused on the application of AI to really hard real world problems. And so we are focusing on things like, human productivity, risk, and national security issues and things like that. And that's kind of the area of our sandbox. But I think one of the ways you cut through the clutter is by using just normal language to describe this fancy, complicated mathematics that are happening behind the scenes. Like at our company, our big thing is what we do and all the patents we file and all that other stuff. They're really complex and fun, and we geek out about them. But at the end of the day, we just make data easier to use. And I think if you can figure out how to describe or distill down your technology into pretty simple terms, and especially a customer value proposition, I think that can go a long way. Unfortunately, our industry, there's a lot of buzzword bingo going on.
Yeah, I've talked to a number of people in the AI world, and you're right. Everybody has a different definition. Everybody has a different set of terms, and they all love them. By the way, did I read that you are either about to become or have become one of the first tech unicorns in Learwood and in the Kansas City area?
Yeah, we have other people. I mean, this is actually kind of funny you bring it up. I have avoided making that statement, but we've got other folks both inside the company and outside the company that are big fans and have actually publicly proclaimed that. Look, at the end of the day, we have thousands of users, hundreds of customers, and what we do is very complex, and we're in really important corners of the world, whether it's in, say, the financial services industry, increasingly in healthcare, or for the federal government in areas of national security and even the intelligence community, where the processing of information has become kind of a critical thing. We just see some good tailwinds, right? I'm the kind of guy, I keep my head down. I do look out in the future and make sure that, we're orienting towards what the world really needs and how we can be better for our customers. But yeah, we've got some good ingredients, right? We've got a great product. It continues to evolve. Our customers really love working with our team and with our technology. And it's hard, but you can't help but run into a messy data problem, almost every day of the week. I'm going to leave talking to you, Tom, and go have lunch with one of the world's largest real estate organizations that sits on a massive treasure trove of data around residential homes, property, and all of the intelligence around that stuff. And they're having trouble making that work, getting all that synthesized and fused, and all the fancy words like disambiguated and all that other stuff. And we run into that all the time, right? I mean, there's just, and that as you're building a business, one, it's like, who's got the problem and how many of those people are there? And I think, we fortunately happened upon that right mix.
Super. When we last talked before the crazy times, you used the metaphor of engineers as artists.
Yeah.
And this is where I think you looked forward and said you weren't sure whether or not that would hold once you grew. Where are you with that metaphor today?
Yeah, man, that's a great question. Yeah, I think when you're building a technology business, and I would have said this exactly the same way, and I probably don't recall it perfectly well, but when you're building technology, it's all about the engineers that are creating the future. The customers will present a problem, or we actually will identify problems within the customer's perception of the problem. And these engineers, they are artists. We still say that to this day. We're an engineering focused culture here. But I would say, I will admit that maybe the canvas sizes are getting a little more specific. As we continue to get bigger and better, we start focusing on perfection. So, for example, one of the things we pioneered recently is how to get a machine learning model to be more accurate, and using other machine learning models to improve the accuracy of a single model, whether the customer brings us a model, whether it's one of our models, or whether it's even an open source model. There's techniques that you can use, things like embedding dimensions into a machine learning model that end up making that better. So this would be akin to like using cobalt paint with actual, minerals in it, as opposed to the fake synthetic stuff. And it's like the artistry, this is why I say the canvas is maybe a little smaller. Some of that artistry is not maybe the broad strokes it used to be. It's more perfecting the technique and the type of tool you might use to increase, for example, accuracy. I mentioned bias before. How we detect bias, whether it's racial bias or some other decision bias in a data ecosystem, is a really critical thing. And that's a project that'll never end. The world's moving, people's attitudes change, and data is very messy. And so some of that artistry, again, is maybe more finely tuned and focused, but I think still the sentiment holds up.
What would it take? What kind of shock to the system would it take to actually go back to that broad brush, large canvas or variable canvas kind of world?
Yeah, well, we still have pockets of that. So one of the things, when you run a business like this and you're, creating, you're innovating and also creating a factory of sorts at the same time, because you have more customers, their demands are significant. You've got to have a way to scale that solution across, more and more customers and increasingly broader set of use cases. You got to kind of do both. As a percentage of the business, the innovation is a critical part. So that's still every single one of our employees participates in our R&D efforts. But I think we have the broad brush strokes for us as a business that is focused on building a product. We've got to be really cognizant not to get outside the lines too much on that. And if we do, we have a very clear understanding of what the customer requirement is and what's driving the need to maybe rethink something or literally get a blank sheet of paper and imagine. And we've done that. We have done that even recently. We started getting into the world of synthetic data, which was a blank canvas aspect, right? We had a customer with a problem and we used our platform, which is very unique in its ability to process and make available billions of data points in models. And we applied a really advanced form of machine learning to create basically a completely new way to think of a data ecosystem. And that came from literally a blank canvas kind of discussion that we had, very purposeful, and then started evolving it very quickly. And then we shared that with a number of clients, and they all had the same cybersecurity related problem. And lo and behold, our intuition was right. So I think, again, you're sort of leading the witness here, Tom, but human ingenuity and intuition is something that once you remove that from someone's life or job or product development, you've sort of lost the magic of what a company really could be. And so I think for us, it's more about like, how do you, as a business owner and budget manager, how do I balance innovation with just making sure customer success is there, And so it's always a really interesting dance. We talk about it all the time. I don't mean to keep rambling, but did you ever hear about the story of how the Walkman was invented?
No. So
the CEO of Sony was an opera freak. He loved opera. And I'm going to totally butcher this story because I'm going to miss half the facts and paraphrase the rest of it. But he rode the train for a couple hours a day. And he said, I want to listen to opera on the train. So, you guys go and think about how I could listen to opera while I'm getting on the train going to and from work, 2 hours a day. And they came back and they gave him the Walkman, a miniaturized recording or playing device that allowed him to play a cassette tape with opera music on it. He was ecstatic, but it had a little red button on it, a record button. And they were all excited because they had a blank canvas and built, what they thought was the perfect machine. And for another $1 more, they could stick the recording function on top of the Walkman. And the CEO said, no, we're going to remove all that. No record button. I don't care how cost effective it is. The customer will be confused by it and it'll impede adoption. And so it was this sort of reductionist concept and Apple does it today too, right? Sure. They feed you something that you don't realize you need. And then once you're hooked, then they start piling all the features. And I think that's one of the things that I think is sort of inspiring when you go back in history of the world's greatest product adoption sort of strategies. They really were a specialized thing, that really solved a problem and became widely adopted. And then only later did they sort of evolve as the consumer requirements evolved with the innovation. So anyway, I get inspired by stories like that, even though they're old. It's from the 80s. I mean, yeah.
They are illustrative. In the life cycle of an organization, where do you see that balance falling away from innovation and away from allowing engineers to participate in innovation to the consumerization of the product?
Yeah, well, in one way, the minute you start measuring R&D output, you've already lost So we don't do that here. We certainly invest in R&D in a measured way. We're fiscally responsible. But I think at some point, if you have customer intimacy, maybe I'll answer this a couple of ways. But if you have customer intimacy and you're really solving like really serious problems, not easy stuff where like a web application or something like that might be able to solve it, but actually fundamental human problems. And if you have that customer intimacy, they will take you on that journey. And I think that's part of, it's like, where do you point the innovation engine? If you're doing ivory tower what ifs, I mean, there's certainly a place for that. But once you build a business, you really need to be customer centered, because that's what a business is. A business exists to solve problems for customers, not to create white space necessarily. And so you can certainly create white space inside of a customer problem or inside of a customer economy. And of course, we were launched by that, right? I started this business out of a massive failure of a contract that I had with Microsoft, the world's largest software company. And I sold them a piece of software and it worked so well, it almost killed me. And that's how this business was born, And so, again, I think for us, focusing the innovation engine on that customer, being more and more customer centered, I think is an important aspect of it. But I also think that just naturally, like you as a human being can impede human ingenuity and innovation if you're not careful. Things sort of have a natural flow, and it's like working out. Unless you're a robot, you sort of go and it's cyclical. At least how I do it. I mean, I raced Ironman, all that other stuff, and world's fittest guy, blah blah blah, a bunch of nonsense. But the reality is, you go in fits and starts. That's just your body needs a little rest and recovery. So does the brain. And so I think as a business leader, one of the things that I'm aware of is I watch when people sort of coalesce around a concept, and you have to sort of watch, encourage that in some ways. Maybe you put some rails up if you really think, but you really kind of have to allow those people the space to bring their own genius to whatever they're thinking about at the time. And I think there's just like a rhythm to that that's hard to quantify and measure, like to give you business feedback. I think the biggest thing is, maybe it's just two little lessons. One, when you have people like that in your business, whether they're technologists or salespeople or front desk people, one, it's, do you really truly appreciate their talent and skill? Like, do you understand really what they're good at? We spend a lot of time here understanding how people make decisions. And so one of the big things we do, we have this whole assessment thing we do, and we train and we teach and we try and figure out, like you and I would start making a decision from completely opposite ends of the spectrum, right? But we might end up at the same spot, and appreciating each other for that, I think, is a key thing. One. So that's the first part. Do I truly understand a person's talent and skill? And the second part is, do I have the wisdom and maturity to give them the space they need to maximize the benefit of that, for whatever the outcome that we're trying to drive towards is, Again, that's assuming that we've got agreement on outcomes, which I also think is absolutely a critical thing running a business. But that's kind of how I do it anyway.
Many organizations lose that empathy for understanding. How did you get there to have that degree of vision into other people, that empathy for other people, to know that? And is that something that you think firms can relearn?
So I don't believe everyone's born equal. I mean, maybe equal is even an improper term. I said it originally to sort of be a little provocative, but I believe there are certain people who are excellent at seeing the future, whether it's good or bad. I think there are certain people who are excellent at seeing the past and understanding the full scope and severity of everything that's come before. Those two types of people are completely at odds. As a more creative type human inside an engineering culture at Torch, I mean, I'm sort of like the living, breathing example of that, because I've got engineers who really are about building and understanding what is. And I'm really a guy that really gets my joy in life about imagining what could be. And so I think having an understanding of who you're sitting across from and figuring out how to put those kind of people in the right task to create optionality is the key. Going to someone that really lives in what has come before and asking them to create optionality for the future is kind of a tough thing. Imagining what could be or different permutations of what could be will always be limited. It will be incremental. Anything based on history is incremental. You look at history. It's kind of funny to say that. But look at history. You look at any of these massive innovations. They come from these leaps of faith, sometimes leaps of logic. They don't come from this relying on this corpus of history to develop a pattern and then relying on incremental change of the pattern or some other kind of tuning of the pattern. That always delivers homogenization. Look at globalization. That's what it is. So you end up with this incremental sort of process, right? Most of these big businesses that everybody loves to invest in these days and talk about these days are led by or instigated by people that did not look to the past for the pattern, but saw an opportunity and maybe did a little calculation on what could be, but probably took a flyer on how to solve it. Yeah.
We've lived through, since our last interview, crazy times, lots of different things. How has Torch adapted to a world where, hey, you might be in the office, or you might not be in the office, or you might be in the office, or you might be hybrid, or those things? How have you adapted to that kind of a world?
Well, yeah, it's really interesting. So we do a lot of work with the U.S. federal government, and because of that, we had a lot of early indication of what was going on with infection rates and all that stuff. And of course, as a company that works there, we had all kinds of interesting mandates that we followed too, and we were happy to do so. So for us, we pretty quickly hunkered down and went 100% remote. So we've always had a physical office. I'm sitting in our headquarters office today in Kansas City, and we're excited to have it and don't have any sort of anticipation or plan to get rid of a physical location. But we did slow down. Like, we were going to expand a little bit more in some other geographies where we have talent. And we did slow that down a little bit because as they started, dealing with kids mostly, right? The kids really drove a lot of the familial behavior. And so people couldn't go to work. They had to work asynchronously. And it was just a very dynamic time. In a lot of ways, it kind of still is. There's a little hangover from that. But we immediately went completely remote, and we used all kinds of, virtual, technology to connect everybody. And then we invested quite a bit in virtual events. We sent people stuff to their homes to kind of keep the love alive from a cultural perspective. We probably hired, almost 100 people, in the first, year of the pandemic or whatever, did all that remote. Well, that on its own was a massive shift for us because we're used to interviewing people in person, and we have, especially for our engineers, we have tests, and we used to have boards that would interview folks. And so that had to evolve pretty quickly. Now we're in a phase where we're in a bit of a hybrid situation, right? As our company's grown, we have employees all over the country. Most of them are in Washington, D.C. or Kansas City. But we've sort of adapted a bit of a hybrid approach. What's been really interesting, and maybe this is kind of the punchline, there's really been two outcomes or effects of having to sort of live through that process. We have become very focused on outcomes, not butts and seats. So for us, that meant really, really clearly defining what we were doing as a business down to each individual role of the business and getting aligned there. So we had an agreement. Hey, we're going to try and do this year, this quarter, this month. Here's what we need you to do. Are we all clear on that? And so in order to allow someone to be able to afford to have someone work asynchronously and flexibly, we had to immediately go to more of an outcomes-based organizational culture. So that was the first big thing. And the second thing, we had to treat people like adults. You have to have faith that the person's going to do their work and that they love the job. And the good news is that we've had very, very low issues with one, turnover, or two, poor performance. We have had some folks that needed a little more direct supervision, and those people struggled maybe a little bit. But as a percentage, very tiny, single digits, So I think that's the two big things, right? One, if you can just, agree on the outcomes and make sure that everybody understands, is clear on what those are and how their role in the company ladders up to that outcome. And two, if you just treat everybody like an intelligent adult and a mature adult, they'll respond favorably, and it'll make life kind of easier and a little happier. So that's been the approach.
Brian, if you woke up tomorrow morning and somebody handed you a cup of whatever your caffeinated beverage of choice is.
Triple espresso.
Ooh, I'm all in. I'm all in. And a magic wand, and said you had the power to change any two things that affect how AI is used. What would those two things be, and why?
Yeah, it's a great one. Actually, I've got this was not rehearsed or anything, but first of all, I think most frustration in life comes from fear, and fear manifests itself in really, crazy ways, sometimes, terrible ways, right? Stress and anxiety comes from a fear of something. And I think that's a failure of information. So if you're familiar, like in psychology, there's a concept of reframing. So when you have an event in your life that you don't like, often what a therapist might do is they might have you work through, like a cognitive behavioral therapist, for example, because I've kind of studied this a little bit because I think it's fascinating. If you reorient the facts, like the facts are there, right? Absolute truth has not changed. It's your interpretation of the truth that is the issue. And so there is a circumstance around you that's creating this environment, whether it's a family issue, financial issue, professional issue, whatever it is. Cognitive behavioral therapy would suggest that reframing the facts will turn a negative into a positive. And if you're not familiar with the whole reframing thing, that's probably an hour-long podcast on its own. But if you start thinking about, like, what's the worst that could happen? How could you think about maybe this thing that you think is negative as a positive? Like, how could you imagine that it could be a positive? And you start going through some of that stuff. To me, that's a failure of information. I think AI and advanced resources can start helping people make better decisions and maybe just be happier people by surfacing correlation and context around sort of think about it like a transaction, right? If you had that information available to you, and I'm not talking about an interface with your phone or an implanted thing, I'm just talking about the concept of whatever is triggering that emotional response, that physical response you might have, a stressor. I believe there's an opportunity to present information in the appropriate way, and maybe even more information. One of the biggest problems we have, like in the enterprise or personally, you're only able to process about 2% of the available information that you have in front of you. So if you think about that just statistically, well, what if you're able to process 8%, 6%, not even 50%, but what if you could process more of the information that was contextual to whatever you're experiencing? You'd make a better decision. You'd have better foresight, and you'd probably lower the temperature of the room. You'd probably be a happier person, probably have less stress. I'm gray like you, dude. And it comes from a hell of a lot of stress and running really hard and all that stuff. And you'd probably have a lot less than that. So that's the first thing, I think. Information.
So are you saying that would have saved my hair? That's what
it would have saved your hair. Yeah. You're 35 or something, right? Yeah.
Something like that.
So I think information can save the world, but it's like, how does it get delivered and how can we frame it appropriately? I think that's what AI can do, right? The power of it is being able to mimic a human's ability to create context and correlation across vast sets of information. I think that's really interesting. The other thing is a lot simpler. There's no reason we should ever have school shootings. And so I have a personal passion project. I won't get into that, but I think there's an opportunity to use information to protect our kids in schools. I've got young daughters and they've lived through all that stuff. And it's really an unfortunate thing that we live in fear because of those things. And I do believe that and again, we're working on some things here conceptually, again, white paper, big old blank canvas about how you might help remove that risk with information and again, better understanding of risks, data, concepts, and information and the relationships they've got. I think AI is a great cure for that and something that we really need to try and help kind of shift the tide there on that particular topic of, say, school shootings or active shooter situations.
Well, that would fundamentally change the world and would make all of us a little bit happier. Brian, how can people continue the conversation? How can they find out about Torch.AI and maybe even your passion project?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'm available on LinkedIn. I hang out there probably once a week or so, and I really enjoy interacting with people. I like doing things like this with you, Tom, because I've lived through a lot, good and bad. And if I can help somebody, I don't give advice anymore, but I'll tell more stories, and you do with that what you want. And I'm full of a lot of ideas and all that stuff. But I really do enjoy supporting people that are trying to make the world a better place as an entrepreneur or aspiring leader in their business. So LinkedIn's a great spot.
Super. Anything you'd like to promote? You've given us a lot of good stuff.
One of these days, I'm going to write a book. I already know the title. It's There Was No Brochure, because if there was a brochure that I read and says, hey, before you become an entrepreneur, you better know these 10 things and how much it's going to cost and how much gray hair you're going to have and all that stuff, I might not have done it. But no, nothing to promote. Just just trying to help others, and I love hanging out with you.
Super. And we are looking forward to that book. So you got to write it at some point.
I will.
Brian Weaver of Torch.AI, thank you for spending time with the Software Process and Measurement Cast listeners.
Great. Thank you, Tom.
In Reread Saturday News, completing a reread is always bittersweet. Today we say goodbye to a friend. Why limit WIP? We're drowning in work. The final chapter is the epilogue, and interwoven are our final notes. Then next week we start on Coaching Agile Teams by Alyssa Atkins. Remember, use the link in the show notes if you do not have a copy of either Why Limit WIP or our upcoming book, Coaching Agile Teams. Help support the podcast, and most importantly, help support the authors. In the next Software Process and Measurement Cast, everyone has a set of attributes they use to describe and measure flow. Let's narrow the field to the most important few and start from there. We'll also have a visit from Tony Timble and his Tell a Story column. If process improvement is a never-ending journey, why do so many people ask, are we there yet?